Hey guys, how is it going? So there was a stream by Pine Creek Duck that just ended, and he was talking about how it doesn't seem to be the case that the story of Jesus' nativity is historical, and it's very difficult to harmonize it. The harmonizations are quite implausible. And that's actually a great segue to what I want to talk about today, because there are some instances in early Christian literature, in literature from the ancient world, where we can pretty conclusively say that the early Christian authors were not just mistaken, but they actually intentionally misrepresented history. And I want to talk about one of these examples. And what actually gave me the idea was a recent blog post by Richard Carrier, which you can find if you go to richardcarrier.info, when he talks about a different example that has to do with Eusebius of Caesarea. I haven't been able to read it yet, so I can't like vouch for it completely. But you should definitely give it a read. I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. But I just want to show you a different example. And today is going to be actually a very chill, relaxing stream, unlike last week where I massively over prepared and I had way too much material to cover. I was like completely exhausted and almost wasn't able to talk at all. Um, but today, given that we are going to take it much more slowly and it's going to be much more easygoing, I will actually do an after party on Discord. So if you stick around for about, let's say, an hour or 90 minutes, then we can all just head over to Discord and have a quick chat. And before I forget, let me actually give out 1,000 Pine points to Rami Gilneas. And unlike Pine Creek, I will actually create like an Excel spreadsheet in Google Docs, and the link is going to be available. And you guys will be able to see who has how many Pine points, right? And we can kind of all compete with each other. Okay, so let's start. Given that we are going to be talking about ancient literature, I think it would be nice to actually see what exactly is the body of literature that we are talking about. So let's specifically look at ancient Christian and Jewish history, because I think obviously a lot of people know that we have writings from ancient history. They maybe know some authors, but I guess most people don't really know, for example, what's the amount of literature that we have extant. And I created this chart that gives you an approximate extent of these surviving texts in pages. And this is thanks to two great websites, earlychristianwritings.com and earlyjewishwritings.com, where they have large amounts of literature. It's not complete, but you can find different texts in other sources. And what's really good is that the sources are available in a machine-readable format. So it's very easy to kind of mine information about how many words are contained in each text, right? So of course we have the Bible. If we look at the Protestant canon, which is 39 books for the Old Testament, 27 books for the New Testament, that's going to give you about 1,500 pages. These are just rounded numbers, by the way. So this is how it looks like, for example, right? This is my Czech study Bible. So that would be the amount that we have here. Then there is, of course, the Deuterocanon, or which is what it's called in, I think, the Roman Catholic Church. In Protestant churches, it's just called the Apocrypha, which are a couple of books that are included in some biblical canons, such as the Roman Catholic, but not in the Protestant canon. That includes, for example, the books of Maccabees, first and second. There is actually even third and fourth, which I think is canonical in some churches, but I'm not actually sure. And then there were, of course, many more scriptures that are still considered sacred by people today. Like one piece of text that a lot of people revere very highly is, for example, on the historicity of Jesus by Richard Carrier, pictured here. So that's another example. Then, of course, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is a very important piece of intertestamental Jewish writing, right? So that's a text or set of texts that were produced after the Old Testament canon closed, after all the books that are now in the Old Testament were written, but before Christians started writing books of the New Testament, right? That would be about less than 500 pages. And here I specifically selected only parabiblical texts because in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have essentially two types of texts. One are just fragments of various books that are in the Bible. So they are basically copies. They are ancient manuscripts of these books. This is very, very important, by the way, because they are by far the oldest manuscripts that we still have. And before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the oldest extant manuscripts of the Old Testament that we have came, I think, from like late antiquity or early Middle Ages. So that's very important. So that would be about, and then the second category of texts are texts that were original to the Dead Sea Scroll community. So they are not just copies of biblical texts. They are actually original writings. There are like theological writings, commentaries on Old Testament texts and stuff like that. And these are about 500 pages. Then we have two guys who wrote a lot, and a lot of their writings were preserved. This is, of course, Philo of Alexandria and Josephus. And really, if you think about it, it's super crazy that for ancient Jewish literature, these two guys are massively overrepresented in the entire body of literature that survives today, right? So if you could like pile up everything that we have, Josephus and Philo would be a massive proportion of that, right? Which means that still, even though we have, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and even though we have obviously the Old Testament, a lot of our thought of Judaism, especially Second Temple Judaism, and more specifically Judaism in the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE, is still very massively we still very massively view it through the lens of these two specific authors, just because so much of their writing survives, and because we don't have anything else, almost anything else, by other people, right? And you can see it when you read secondary literature, and there are references to primary literature. If that's on the subject, it's very, very often going to be either to Josephus or Philo, just because we don't have almost anyone else. I don't actually have any works of Philo. I'm going to get some probably for Christmas. But this is, for example, the Jewish War by Josephus, right? So both the amount or the extent of extant literature is roughly the same for both. It's about 1,200 pages, which means we have actually more writings preserved from them, from each, than the extent of the Protestant Old Testament, right? And that's crazy if you think about it, because obviously the period of time in which the Old Testament was written is very, very long. And these two guys just lived inside 2 centuries, right? Of course, the period of time when the Old Testament was written is not as long as Christian apologists would have you believe, but that's obviously much, much longer than 2 centuries. And then we have other ancient Jewish texts. When it comes to specifically parabiblical literature, which means roughly, let's say, theological or religious literature, that would be about 2,000 pages. I actually have all of it in 2 volumes. Not everything here is intertestamental parabiblical literature, because this, for example, contains some texts which are probably dated later, after the start of the Common Era. And I'm getting way too many books here now. So yeah, by the way, not everything that we have from ancient Judaism is, or from ancient Jewish authors, is religious literature, obviously. We have even profane literature. For example, there is a guy named Ezekiel who wrote in the 3rd century. He was a Hellenized Jew, and he wrote a Greek play about Moses, from which we have some relatively extensive fragments. I think we have like 20% of the entire work. So that's really interesting. And then, of course, the last category, which is interesting for us, is Gnostic Christianity, which we have about 1,000 pages of that, including fragments that are found in other authors, right? So it's important to realize that these bars are not mutually exclusive. There is some overlap between them because, for example, a lot of the material that we know about Gnostic Christianity is also included in early Christian authors. But I have some editions of the Nagamati codices here. So yeah, and then of course, there is a massive volume of early Christian literature. So if you just look at this bar of this chart, you can immediately see that we have much, much more text from early Christian authors than we have from ancient Judaism. And this is, of course, because Christianity is the sect that became popular and they won. So they were in control, they had power and resources. They were the ones that copied books and circulated them, and they were the ones that made the decisions which books will be preserved and which ones won't, right? So obviously, they were interested mostly in preserving Christian writings, right? Not exclusively. A lot of ancient pagan, let's say, or Greek and Roman literature was preserved thanks to early Christians and late ancient and medieval Christians. But still, there was probably an overwhelming bias for preserving primarily Christian literature. And we have even individual examples. For example, we have a papyrus which originally contained an unknown work on mathematics, on geometry by Archimedes. But then the text was actually scrubbed out of it, and it was replaced by some Byzantine hymns. And the reason why we know the existing text was there originally is that contemporary scholars actually discovered that there are trace amounts of the original writing still preserved. And today we have advanced imaging techniques which actually enable us to visualize the trace amounts and read the Greek letters, even though most of the writing material is already gone. And this is how we discovered a new, previously unknown work by Archimedes, which means probably there is potentially lots and lots of Greek and Roman texts that still exist. They are just in traces amounts of writing material underneath later Christian writings in extant manuscripts. And what classicists are going to do probably for the next 100 years is go through all of the extant manuscripts and put them through some advanced imaging equipment and check basically whether they will be able to discover some new texts, and who knows what we will be able to find, right? This is actually a very promising and very new field of textual criticism. But if we just look at anti-Nicene fathers, you can see that this is about 10,000 pages of text. What do I mean by anti-Nicene? So the early Christian literature, let's say the ancient Christian literature, is usually split into three periods. Anti-Nicene, which is before the first Council of Nicaea in 325. Then there are the so-called Nicene Fathers, who wrote around the period of the Nicene Council. The reason why this is like a standalone category is because that's, even though it's a relatively short period of time, there were authors active in that period of time which were extremely prolific, and vast amounts of their writings were preserved. That includes, for example, Eusebius or Athanasius. And there are post-Nicene fathers. That's basically everyone who wrote later. That would be like Jerome, Augustine of Hippo, and so on and so forth. I don't actually have the early Christian authors, because that's like a massive volume of literature. I was able to find it on Amazon, right? So this is the anti-Nicene edition in 10 volumes. It's a very famous translation and edition by Philip Schaft. So this is anti-Nicene in 10 volumes, and this is Nicene and post-Nicene in like 15 volumes, I think. Yeah. Let me see how many pages they have. 8,000 pages. Okay. So yeah, that's the extent of that early Christian literature. And what's really insane, if you think about it, is how much just a couple of authors are overrepresented in the surviving literature, right? So if you look at these 10,000 pages and we break it down and we look at who is represented, you will see immediately that for very influential streams of Christian tradition, for example, Christian Gnosticism, we don't have almost anything. But then there are individual guys who wrote a lot, and a lot of their writings happened to be preserved, which account for massive proportion of the surviving literature, right? So this is a breakdown by 50 years for the entire Nicene Christian literature. If you are confused by bulk of the New Testament being dated to early 2nd century, that's because I just took the median date of the usual dating range, right? And the usual dating range for some of the writings in the New Testament is so long that the medium is actually in the 2nd century. It includes Acts of the Apostles, some of the pseudepigraphical writings of Paul, and of course all of the other letters that scholars don't think were actually written by the authors they are attributed to, like the letters of Peter, especially second, the letters of John, and so on and so forth, right? And then if we actually move to second half of the 2nd century and later, you will see immediately that there are individual writers that are massively represented in the surviving works, right? In the surviving texts. That's Clement of Alexandria for the second half of the 2nd century. And in the first half of the 3rd century, that's even worse, because here we have almost 2/3 split. 1/3 is exclusively Tertullian. A second third is almost exclusively Origen, and third is everyone else, right? So again, as you can see, our thinking about this specific period in time is massively skewed by us essentially having so many writings by just two guys, right? That's really interesting. And then in the second half of the 4th century, there is one very prolific author, Lactantinus, who was, if, for example, knew personally Constantine. He is the earliest source for his conversion. And he wrote a series of biographies of Roman emperors who persecuted Christians, with a specific focus on how these Christian persecutors died. And there are very long and very gruesome descriptions of their deaths, which were, of course, seen as punishments for them persecuting Christianity. So again, I want to overemphasize like how much just a handful of guys are overrepresented in the entire body of surviving literature, right? There are dozens of early Christian authors that we know existed, and we have maybe some fragments. We have other people talking about them, like Eusebius, but in some cases we know that they were actually very prolific authors. They wrote a lot, but their works were just lost. And for every single author like that, there must have been many, many more which existed, wrote a lot, but they just happened not to be mentioned by any of the author that survived until today, right? So for everyone that we know about, there must have been many more that we don't know about, and we never will. This is really interesting. Like I remember when I first realized this, and it was like a really interesting revelation, because I guess most people just don't know about it when they think about ancient literature. And this overrepresentation isn't really the case when we look at non-Christian literature. So I actually went to Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, which is the largest online repository of Greek literature. It covers mostly ancient Greek literature, right? So this is probably the most important tool for classical philologists. So if you do philology, ancient Greek philology, the resource that you are going to be using the most is Thesaurus Lingua Graecae, because it allows you to do full text searches for individual words, expressions, and individual forms of words, right? So if you are, for example, writing an article about a specific maybe case or how some specific verb was used or something like that, the first thing that you do is to look up every instance, every occurrence of that specific form, of that specific word in Thesaurus Lingua Graecae, right? But it's amazing even for historians because it's just basically all of or most of surviving Greek literature. And I just broke it down by century, and I highlighted the most prolific author, or to be more precise, the author of whom we have the largest amount of surviving texts. Because we actually know from Greek literature that there were many, many people who wrote extensively, massively. They wrote hundreds and hundreds of books, but we don't have anything. Like all of their books were lost. One of them is, for example, Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. Epicurus was very prolific, supposedly, but we just have a couple of letters that he wrote, and those might be forgeries. Otherwise, we just have fragments, right? But if you look at it, it's really interesting. We see obviously the massive spike in surviving literature in the classical period. Then we have a slight decline in the Hellenistic period, and then we see the Golden Age and the Silver Age represented in Greek literature as well. This is, by the way, Greek. It doesn't cover, obviously, Latin literature, right? That would be Thesaurus Lingua Latinae, but they don't have these kinds of statistics. And there is actually a massive boom in surviving Greek literature in the 2nd century, probably because that was a period of relative peace and prosperity under the 5 good emperors, right? And ending with Marcus Aurelius. And then in 4th and 5th century, the amount of literature just skyrockets. And this is to a large degree because we suddenly have very large amounts of surviving Christian literature. So if you think that late antiquity, right before the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, when various Germanic barbaric kingdoms emerged in Western Europe, was a period of decline and destruction, we can't really say that based on the amounts of surviving literature, right? Because paradoxically, we have for these dark centuries, we have much more texts than for the periods of time that we considered to be classic. The problem is that this is again skewed because of presence of Christianity, right? Christians wrote a lot, and they were the ones whose literature was survived, and specifically 4th and 5th century are centuries when Christianity was no longer illegal. So it was much easier for Christians to write, and it was much easier for their writings to be preserved because church was already there. It had a very good organizational structure, and it had support from the state, from the Roman Empire, right? So this is why we have so many surviving writings. As you can actually see, the proportion of the most prolific author actually gets higher in these 2 last centuries, precisely because there were these Christian authors who wrote a lot, and a lot of their writings survives. But when we look at earlier centuries, we don't really see that being the case, right? For example, in the 2nd century, the author from whom the largest amount of literature survives is Polybius, but he only accounts for a very small percentage of all the writing that we have for the 2nd century BCE. And yeah, by the way, literature was deliberately destroyed, like totally. We have actually many sources telling us, even Christian sources, telling us about Christians burning pagan books, right? Serapion, the famous, where the famous Library of Alexandria was housed, the remnants of the library, which were still there in late antiquity, were very famously destroyed by monks, who also like lynched Hypatia, female philosopher, right? And it's really actually really interesting to look into history of monasticism, because early monks, like today, monks have a reputation of being very peaceful, right? But actually, early monks were like hooligans. They were, for the most part, the ones that were responsible, especially in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, for destruction of many pagan temples, destruction of pagan writings, and just violence and intimidation against people who didn't convert to Christianity. There are actually reports of like troops of monks surrounding cities that still had pagan population in them, demanding people to convert and demanding destruction of pagan buildings like altars, temples, and stuff like that. So yeah, they were just completely mad, and it actually kind of became a social problem later on, and that's why we actually see them. There was an effort in the church to start organizing the monks into orders, which was tradition that was obviously continued in Middle Ages, and that's why we have like or monastic orders today, right? And the reason why these orders existed or why they developed, it actually came from military organizations, right? So Christians at some point became interested in organizing monks as armies, essentially, of soldiers, precisely to give them discipline and get them under control, because they were just running around causing ruckus. Yeah. And this is just the last. I grabbed the top 30 authors. You won't probably be able to make out the names, but I don't think that's very important. What's important, again, is to see how Christian authors are massively represented. Christian authors are the blue bars, and the orange bars are non-Christian authors. The most prolific author in all of ancient Greek literature is actually Johannes, who was a Christian, right? The second most prolific is Galen, who was preserved because he was just the magician, and his medical treatises were used for centuries, both in the Arabic world and in the Christian world, all the way up until basically the Enlightenment, right, and the start of modern medicine. Okay, so that was just a brief introduction, which lasted for about half of the entire stream, and now we can get into the topic itself, right? So we are going to be talking about a specific instance where we can pretty much conclusively say, with very high degree of confidence, that a bunch of early Christian authors actually purposefully misrepresented history, and they were not just mistaken about what happened in the past. So let's take a look at it. And let's start with what Josephus says. So there is this very famous passage in Josephus that gets bring up a lot because it supposedly describes execution of James, Jesus's brother. And it's very hotly debated, especially in discussions about Jesus's historicity. Because obviously, if we have a historical account of someone's brother being executed, well, that guy probably existed, right? You can kind of bullshit your way out of it, but that gets quite implausible or ad hoc or both. But there is obviously a question whether the passage is authentic, and more specifically, whether the words Jesus, who was called Christ, was maybe added later in the manuscript. Who added it, when, and stuff like that. But this passage is actually really interesting for a different reason, and that's the reason that I want to highlight today, right? So what's exactly the situation? We need to brush up on our ancient history of ancient Palestine, right? So the year is 62, and Porcius Festus, who was the procurator of Roman province of Judea, just died. And Emperor Nero sent his replacement, who was called Lucius Albinus. And while Albius was en route from probably Rome to Alexandria, because you would normally land in Alexandria and then you would walk to the port to Judea. King Herod Agrippa II appointed a guy named Ananus ben Ananus, Ananus son of Ananus, a high priest in Jerusalem. And this might make you think, like, why is it the case if there was a Roman province of Judea, which obviously also included Jerusalem? First of all, why was there a king named Herod? What was his kingdom, right? And what business did he have appointing high priests in Jerusalem, which is under Roman control, right? Well, King Herod Agrippa II was actually gradually given land in Palestine. He, for example, held land which was previously held by Philip the Tetrarch, one of the sons of Herod the Great, who, after his death, his realm was partitioned among his family, and it was gradually absorbed into the Roman Empire. And then the realm of Herod Agrippa II was extended gradually. So by 62, he, for example, governed or ruled about half of Galilee. The second half was in Judea, in the Roman province, right? And very importantly, with this land, he was given the right to appoint the high priests in Jerusalem. So even though he didn't govern Jerusalem, he was given the legal right to appoint high priests, right? Which he did. And by the way, this Herod Agrippa II is the Herod Agrippa who is present during the trial of Paul in Caesarea, right? Don't confuse it with Herod Agrippa I, who is a very colorful character in Richard Graves's series or book, Claudius. Completely different Herod Agrippa, right? But this king appointed a new high priest, Ananus. And Ananus, according to Josephus, assembled the Sanhedrin Council, which was the ruling body in Jerusalem. And he had James, brother of Jesus, some Jesus, we don't know if it's Christ or a different Jesus, and some other people, and he had them executed. And this actually caused discontent among the most equitable of the citizens. This is what Josephus says later on, who were the most uneasy about the breach of the laws, because apparently this wasn't legal. And Josephus actually tells us what was the legal problem. And apparently it was not allowed for the high priest to assemble the Sanhedrin Council without a permission of the procurator. And because procurator wasn't in Jerusalem, he was still en route. He couldn't give the permission, so the whole thing was illegal, basically. And these most equitable citizens actually went out of their way to complain to Albinus. They went to meet him on his way from Alexandria and complained. And Albinus became very angry, and he sent an angry letter to Ananus, and that eventually resulted in King Herod Agrippa removing him from the position of high priesthood, and he gave the high priesthood to Jesus, the son of Damneus. The hypothesis is obviously that originally this is the Jesus that's being discussed in the passage, right? So a guy named James, who we know nothing else about, was killed illegally. People got upset. So King Agrippa basically mitigated the situation by appointing the brother of the executed person the new high priest. And they were both sons of Damneus, Jesus and James. That's the hypothesis, right? Or it was James the Just, brother of Jesus. Why is this important? So why am I talking about it? Well, this is because it's pretty much everything, and this is pretty much all that Josephus says about it, right? It's in the last book of his Antiquities, where he goes on to describe events leading up to the Jewish War. And this is just like one minor incident that takes place, and that's it, right? But here come Christian authors writing about it later on. So let's start with Origen of Alexandria, who wrote he lived in the second half of the 2nd century to the first half of the 3rd century. So I think, again, Celsus is dated to the first half of the 3rd century. And here what it says. And he's arguing against Celsus or Celsus, who was a guy who I think about 100 years later or 70 years later wrote a polemic against Christians. This is the earliest extant polemic against Christians. It's obviously extant only in fragments. Because Origen quotes the work extensively, so we can piece together large portions of the surviving texts. But Christians preserved the polemic, the rebuttal of Origen, but they didn't they didn't bother to preserve the original writing of Celsus, right? So we don't have Celsus, we just have the Christian reply, which I find really interesting, right? It would be just like if 2000 years from now, scholars, historians discovered that Christians living after the 21st century just deleted all the videos of new atheists, and they only preserved on their like hard drives rebuttals and responses by Christian YouTubers. That's essentially the same situation, right? So this Celsus wrote about Christianity. He is, for example, the earliest author who talks about the empty tomb that we know of, right? I think he's dated to around 170 CE, which would be, let's say, 100 years after the earliest Gospels were written, right? So we don't actually have the empty tomb for about the first 100 years of the existence of Christianity mentioned outside Christian writings, which is really interesting. And really, he's the only one that talks about the resurrection of Jesus. If you don't count Testimonium Flavianum, preserved again in Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews, which I don't count, by the way. I don't think that's authentic. And if there was like an authentic core, it certainly didn't talk about Jesus rising from the dead on the third day, right? So if you discard that, and if you look at people, non-Christian authors mentioning Christianity in the first 100 years after Jesus' death, then they don't mention the resurrection. They mentioned that Jesus was crucified, for example, Tacitus. They mentioned that Jesus was active in Palestine, for example, Lucian, but they don't say he was raised from the dead. And they even don't say Jesus believed he was raised from the dead. Pliny the Younger just says that Christians sing hymns to Christ, but he doesn't say anything about him, right? So really, we only have this claim being acknowledged first by Celsus, as far as I know. Right, so back to the topic. Origen, in his writing against Celsus, actually uses the passage that we were just talking about in his polemic against non-Christian. And he says, for in the 18th book of his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus bears witness to John as having been a Baptist, and as promising purification to those who underwent the rite. This is completely correct. So if we pick a copy of Antiquities of the Jews today, we look up book 18, we will find a passage describing John the Baptist. Perfectly fine. And given that Origen is quoting a specific book, he knows it's in book 18, he very probably had the work of Josephus in front of him, right? So he's not relying on information that someone else gave him. And he doesn't indicate that he has this from any other source. But then he goes on to describe the passage that we were just talking about, the passage about the execution of James, supposedly James the Just. And he says, now this writer, although not believing in Jesus as the Christ, in seeking after the cause of the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, whereas he ought to have said that the conspiracy against Jesus was the cause of these calamities befalling the people, since they put to death Christ, who was as a prophet, says nevertheless, being, although against his will, not far from the truth, that these disasters happened to the Jews as a punishment for the death of James the Just, who was a brother of Jesus, called Christ, the Jews having put him to death, although he was a man most distinguished for his justice. Very complicated sentence, but basically Origen claims that Josephus attributed the Jewish war and the destruction of the Jewish temple to Jews being punished for executing Jesus' brother. That's the claim, right? He claims, look, guys, if you just open Josephus and you what you will read is that Josephus, this guy who wasn't a Christian and who had no interest in promoting Christianity, right, actually says the Jews were punished for crucifying Jesus's brother, for executing Jesus's brother. Sorry, he was stoned, he wasn't crucified. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem is that's not what Josephus says. This is a claim that's found nowhere in the Antiquities of the Jews. We have it today. We can check, right? And here's the kicker. I spent the first about 30 minutes of this stream talking about the extant ancient literature, how much of it survived, and how much of it is lost. And I already mentioned that if we imagine the entire body of ancient literature that was produced, we have just a very tiny fragment of it. And even more interestingly, the very tiny fragment that we have mentions some authors which we know existed, but there must have been many, many more authors who just happened to be not mentioned in any of the surviving works, right? So we have names of some people, but for every name that we have, there must have been many, many more names that we will never know about. These people wrote, other people talked about their writings, they wrote about their writings, but neither these people nor the people who wrote about them were preserved. We will never know that they existed. And I can just give you like a rough idea of the quantities of literature that we are talking about. This is obviously different for different periods of time. It's different in Latin and different in Greek, different for different genres, obviously. But for example, we have names of about 600 historians that wrote in the Hellenistic period. That's starting with the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 and ending with the Battle of Actium at 31 BC, right? So there's about 600 names that we have. For some of them, we have fragments, and we have them being mentioned by some people. But in most cases, we just have their name. Like we know that they existed, they were historians, right? So 600 people. How many of them do you think we actually have extended fragments from? Fragments that would actually, when they are published, actually make up for like thick volumes, right? So out of 600 people, how many do you think we actually have? I'll just wait for the stream to catch up. Just type a number in the chat and I'll see it. And the person who gets the closest is going to get 1,000 pi points. So 1,000 pi points for the best guess on how many Hellenistic historians who wrote in Greek we actually have extending fragments from. Which means if we print it and they are being printed, it actually amounts for like several volumes, right? So we have some examples, 7, 3, 3, 500, 5. Okay, I will give you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, stop. And I should see myself counting down. Okay, let's wait for the stream to catch up. Okay, here we go. So it's actually 3, which means digital noses and Roman bezel got it right, exactly right, actually, which is amazing. So 1,000 pine points to each one of you. It's Polybius, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and Diodorus of Sicily. So that's the amount of literature that we know existed, and that's the amount of literature out of that which we have. And for every author in the group of 600, there must have been many, many more which wrote, but we will never know about them, which is insane, right? Which brings me back to the topic of the stream. So we've just seen Origen of Alexandria basically citation bluffing, right? He made a claim about what is what is to be found in a different work by a different author, but we can actually go and check that this is not the case. Now imagine if Antiquities of the Jews happened to be lost. Well, that he would get away with it, right? He would make a claim. We would never know this claim is false because we wouldn't be able to check the original, and there would be books published called Fragments of Josephus, and it would cite every reference and every paraphrase, every quotation from Josephus, and this paragraph from Origen would be there as one of the fragments of Josephus, right? And all the scholars would just take it at face value, and they would work with it. And they would be kind of scratching their heads, thinking, okay, why is it the case that Josephus wasn't a Christian, but he still attributed the fall of Jerusalem to the execution of the brother of Jesus? That's really weird, right? Like, why would he do that? Maybe he converted to Christianity later in his life. But the thing is that luckily the writings of Josephus were preserved. They were preserved, by the way, by Christians, right? If we look at the textual tradition, the manuscript tradition behind Antiquities of the Jews, they were preserved by Christians and to a lesser degree by Arabic writers. Eusebius, for example, was very important for preservation of the works of Josephus. He's actually the biggest suspect or the lead suspect for interpolating or just forging the Simonium Flavianum, right? So when people think about who might have tampered with it, a very obvious candidate is Eusebius, just because of his relation to transmission of that specific work. So yeah, I just find it completely crazy, right? That yeah, if something like this happens, for example, here we call it citation bluffing, right? That's a guy claiming a different author, a different scholar, says something, providing a citation. But if you actually go and check, that's not what it says. So let's move on. Now we have another guy, everyone's favorite, Eusebius of Caesarea, or Caesarea, who was who is actually the oldest or the earliest surviving Christian historian. He wrote a history focusing mostly on the history of the Christian Church, or most exclusively on the history of the Christian Church. And he was active when Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. He also wrote his biography, which gives a different story of Constantine conversion. That's a topic for another video. We actually have 3 different stories from the ancient world about how Constantine converted to Christianity, and it's very interesting to pick them apart. But this guy, Eusebius, says, Josephus, at least, has not hesitated to testify in his writings, where he says, these things happened to the Jews to avenge James the Just, who was a brother of Jesus, that is called the Christ. For the Jews slew him, although he was a most just man. And then he says, and the same writer records his death also in the 20th book of Antiquities in the following words. And then he goes on to say, then he goes on to quote Josephus verbatim. So he actually quotes him word for word in the second quotation, but the first quotation is made up. So he just invented a quotation from Josephus that isn't found anywhere in Antiquities of the Jews, right? And again, as I mentioned, we know that Eusebius knew Josephus. Like, he had a copy of Antiquities of the Jews in front of him when he wrote, right? Because he quotes it verbatim. But then he just completely made up a citation that is nowhere to be found in Antiquities of the Jews, right? So yeah, that's super spicy. And let's go to the third guy, Jerome, who was a very important Latin-speaking, Latin writing author who lived about 100 years after Eusebius, who says in the 18th book of his Antiquities, he, meaning Josephus, most openly acknowledges that Christ was slain by the Pharisees on account of the greatness of his miracles, that John the Baptist was truly a prophet, and that Jerusalem was destroyed because of the murder of James the Apostle. He wrote also concerning the Lord after this fashion. And then he goes on to quote Testimonium Flavianum. Now, when it comes to Jerome, I would maybe give him a pass. He quotes Testimonium Flavianum again word for word, which would suggest that he had a copy of the writings of Josephus, the Antiquities of the Jews, in front of him. But it could be the case that he just copied it from a previous source. And the reason why I think that is because he actually botched the quotation of Antiquities. He conflates two different places together. What Josephus says about John the Baptist, which is found in 18th book, and what Josephus doesn't say about James the Just, right? What he does says about James is found in the 20th book. He just conflates this into one passage, which sounds like one passage, and he says this is found in the 8th book, which isn't the case. Like I didn't look this up, but I think book 8 in Antiquities of the Jews would be dealing with like Moses, right? Because Josephus actually starts Antiquities of the Jews is essentially Jewish history. The point of the work was to show to Greeks and Romans that Jews are not like some barbarians. They actually have a very old and ancient history behind them, and they, as such, should be very highly valued, very highly regarded by Romans, the same way how the Romans regarded Greeks very highly, and the Greeks regarded Egyptians very highly. In both cases, it was because they were looking up to a much older, much more ancient culture, which had a much longer, a very rich tradition, right? And Josephus says, look, actually, we also have a very long tradition, right? It goes all the way back to Moses, at least, and it goes even further back to Patriarch and Noah and stuff like that, right? That was the point of his writing. But so, yeah, like 8th book would be probably, let's say, somewhere like deep in the Old Testament, balls deep in the Old Testament. So, yeah, that's it, basically. So these are 3 people which I think we can establish with very, very high degree of confidence. They lied, and they knew what they are doing. They had a book by Josephus called Antiquities of the Jews opened in front of them, either as a codex or as a papyrus scroll. But they decided to say something other than what it actually says, which really makes you think, like, what else, which they say, is made up? There is one guy named Irenaeus, which I also think lied, and it's very, very probable. And I think there are very good reasons for why he lied, or there's very good evidence that he lied. Actually, we can establish that with very high degree of confidence. That's for a different video that covers more ground, so I didn't want to smash everything together. But for example, Irenaeus and Eusebius are the only 2 people, and Jerome actually. So these 3 are the only people who quote Papias at any length, right? And Eusebius and Jerome are the only 2 people who quote the key paragraph from Papias, where Papias says where he got his information from, right? This is the famous passage that everyone brings up, where Papias says that he knew companions of presbyters who knew disciples of Jesus. And this establishes this custody of the traditional gospel authorship, right? And these guys also are the earliest who say that Papias claimed that Mark and Matthew wrote a gospel. Did he really claim that? I think he probably did, right? Like, let's be fair. I think these guys didn't lie about everything. Eusebius specifically says that he thinks that Papias was kind of stupid. He was a man of very low intelligence, or very little intellect. So I think Papias really did write that, right? I think that claim is authentic. Which texts he is talking about, and whether he has reliable information, right? Because Papias, of course, could be either lying or mistaken. That's a different matter. But I think we should still lower our confidence about what these guys are saying, because there are instances where we can establish they were actually dishonest on purpose. And the question is, why were they being dishonest? And I think probably a very good reason is that there was a lot at stake, right? They were, unlike most of the pagans, in a worldview which included eternal punishment of the sinners, of people who didn't convert to Christianity, right? So suddenly, for them, the stakes were much, much higher. They had much higher incentive, basically, to tell white lies, because this kind of lie was specifically told in polemical context in order to promote Christianity. Origen, who is, as far as I can tell, the earliest who made this claim, specifically made it in the work against Kelsos, against a pagan, where he was basically debunking a writing aimed at deconstructing or destroying Christianity, or raising doubt in Christianity. So obviously he was massively interested, motivated to make this claim. And it's a really interesting claim. It's a super spicy claim if you think about it. That there was this guy named Josephus who wasn't a Christian, but even he, don't you know, admitted that the destruction of the Jewish temple and Jerusalem in the Jewish war was because the Jews executed Jesus' brother. And he says, like, you don't have to basically take it from us. Go look at your own historians, right? Which includes Josephus. Even though they will agree with what we are saying. This is kind of the same strategy or the same rhetoric that apologists use even today when they say, okay, we don't have to trust only the Bible. We can look at non-Christian ancient writings and we can establish these facts from non-Christian writings, right? This is, of course, not true. Like when you get into the debate about the resurrection, they have to rely on the Bible. They have to rely, for example, on disciples experiencing Jesus, resurrected Jesus, eating a piece of fish, them touching his wounds, like poking his holes, right, fingering his holes, and Jesus teaching them after his resurrection for 40 days, right? Do we find this in Suetonius? No, right? That's only found in the New Testament. But that's exactly the passages that do the explanatory work in the resurrection hypothesis, right? These are the things that are supposedly very difficult to account for on alternative hypotheses. But still, the rhetoric is there. Like, you don't have to just rely on the Bible, right? It's not just the Bible tells me so. We have all of these non-Christian authors, and they agree with us, don't you know, right? So that's exactly the same rhetorical strategy, right? So this is what I wanted to cover. But I actually have much, much more content because I thought this is going to take much less time than it actually did. So I have two things that I want to do now. First is I went recently through my subscriptions on YouTube and look at what kind of YouTube channels I'm subscribed to. And then I realized that there are a lot of channels that are related to the Great Debate, specifically channels run by non-Christians, which are now defunct, which means you will probably not find them very easily. Maybe they don't get recommended that often. And if you're not subscribed, you have almost no chance of discovering them, right? But they are still interesting. They are still worth checking out because they have a lot of content. And I realized that maybe a lot of people who joined like the Great Debate community today, recently, maybe through Pine Creek Dark, don't know about these channels because they were not around, let's say 10 years ago or 5 years ago when these channels were being active. So this is actually my present to you. I'm now going to list 10 channels which I think are still worth checking, even though they don't produce any content anymore. Some of the channels I actually haven't listened to, haven't watched for a very long time. So I don't completely like vouch for 100% of the information contained there, but I remember enjoying them when they were still active. So let's start with Anti-Citizen X. He had an excellent, in my opinion, series called Meditations, where he just meditates on various subjects, for example, on the nature of omnipotence. I remember that I actually learned a lot about various paradoxes of omnipotence and how various strategies for fixing it generate more problems from his videos. Then he has some counter apologetic content as well. Then there is Deeper Than Dogma, which used to be a podcast, essentially, a YouTube show run by people who are, I think, now no longer active in the Great Debate community. So that's definitely worth checking out. I especially recommend two types of content. One is about epistemology. They have some really good guests. And the second are presentation by Floyd FP, which he is an amateur, just like me, but he's actually very knowledgeable, very well read, as far as I can tell. He's still active, but I think he doesn't produce videos that often. And he gave at least two really interesting presentations, which I think are completely legit. Then we have King Krokodak. This has basically nothing to do with history, but it covers a lot of biology and physics. I think he studies physics, if I'm not mistaken. So there is a lot of content related to that if you are interested. Then there is, of course, Non-Stamp Collector. I think people will probably know him even if they are recent joiners because he's very popular. Yeah, but like 10 years ago, he was one of the most popular members of the Great Debate community. All of his cartoons are completely hilarious. He has one of the best of Yahweh as a fictional character in like an extended narrative, right? His characterization of Yahweh, kind of imagining what kind of person would Yahweh have to be if you take all of the Old Testament seriously, is really good. There is Mr. Deity, who is kind of similar. His like depiction of Yahweh is maybe a little bit more naive and less malevolent. He's more like incompetent and not evil. But here, like, I think this is even better. Then we have Ozymandias Ramses II, which, as you can tell from his YouTube name, is an angsty 16-year-old edgelord. No, he's actually a proper philosopher. He has a PhD. He's not active anymore. I was told he spends his time somewhere canoeing in wilderness of Canada, cut off from the internet forever. But he was around back in the day, and he's discussed a lot of topics related to philosophy of logic, for example, epistemology and stuff like that. And I specifically remember when presuppositional apologetics started becoming popular, let's say around 2011, I was freaking out because, and this was probably experience of a lot of people, this was completely new, at least for me, for a lot of lay people, and we didn't know how to react to it because presuppositional apologetics is obviously really dumb, but it does make you think about things that most people normally don't think about. Like sometimes when people ask me what's the best argument for Christianity, what's the best apologetic, I say presuppositional apologetic, and I'm not kidding, because for me the value in these arguments is not because I find them convincing. I don't, but it's because they make you interested. They make you look up, gather information about topics that you wouldn't normally know about. For example, biology, right? Evolution, cosmology, and presuppositional apologetics kind of caught everyone by surprise because it made them think about justifications of logic, justifications of morality was still around, right? But justifications of some basic beliefs. And I remember I was just completely freaking out. So I actually sent a private message to Ozymandias, and I was like, how do you just like what's the foundation for the laws of logic? I can figure this out, right? And he basically sent me a very detailed and very kind and loving response. And he explained to me this is fine, like there is nothing to worry about. And then he directed me to some of his videos. And after watching them, I felt relieved. I like it kind of clicked, right? So I understood, okay, yeah, this is what's going on, and this is why it's not the problem, right? Then there is Real Theology. They don't have that many videos, but their channel is really interesting. They do, or they did, I should say. They only posted last video a year ago, so they might be back. They did mostly interviews with interesting people. I think it's a bunch of students of philosophy of religion, something like that. They are definitely worth checking out. By the way, if I haven't mentioned this already, all the links to all of these channels are going to be, actually are already in the description of this stream. Then we have Non Sequitur. That's a channel that's no longer active. It was very infamous for featuring Steve McRae, and there was a massive YouTube drama of him basically falling out with his co-host, which I now don't recall his name. Sorry about that. Uh, but they actually hosted a lot of debates. They hosted a lot of interesting conversations, interviews. So if you can just basically ignore hours and hours of discussion about the definition of atheism, which is everyone's favorite topic, then I think you will find this channel very interesting. Then there is the Magic Sandwich Show, which looks like they might be back because the last video was 9 months ago, but I think they were on hiatus for a very, very long time. Yeah, they just put out a video a year ago, The Magic Sandwich Show returns. But this goes way back, and you will see a lot of people that are no longer active in the community, but they were very, very prolific back then around the circle. Like it was a circle around JD Kane, for example, and people like that. DPR Jones, who, as far as I understand, actually passed away, which is obviously a shame. Aaron Ra was, I think, one of the co-hosts actually. So if you like the Christian version of Frank Turek, then you are going to enjoy this, right? We all know Aaron Ra is the atheist equivalent of Frank Turek. And then there is a guy that you might also know, Theoretical Bullshit. I think his name is Cliff. He is a real world actor. He actually starred in some, I think, TV show or something like that. So he has a life outside YouTube, unlike us. He has a career in entertainment, but he is actually very, very smart. And about 5 years ago, he put out a lot of content which is really well thought out. At least I remember it as being very well thought out. I'm not sure how much his videos hold up, but I think they are still definitely worth checking out. So yeah, these are just my recommendations for the top 10 channels that are now defunct. Not necessarily top 10, but like 10 in no particular order of importance. So that was the first thing that I wanted to do in the remainder of the time. The second thing was actually highlight some. Oh yeah, I completely forgot to talk about this, so I'll just skip it. Don't pay attention to that. I actually wanted to talk about comments because I've been getting a lot of comments. That's great for the channel. If you comment, that I'm told boosts the channel's visibility on YouTube. It boosts the visibility to the algorithm, and it obviously brings not just me but all of us much closer to our goal of achieving 1,000 subscribers by the end of this year, which will allow me to create community posts, and I will just completely spam your feed with amazing, delicious jokes and factoids from primary ancient literature. And we all want that, don't we? So I'm super happy that you comment. And I just want to highlight some comments that I found really interesting. Feel free to comment, obviously, if you are watching this video later. If you feel intimidated by like how well thought these comments are, don't be. A lot of people, for example, just say thank you, which obviously is massively appreciated. So you just like, if you like the stream or even if you dislike it, let me know because that's going to help the channel either way, right? So we have Antikythera, which is an island in the Aegean. I think it's one of the Kiklat Islands, if I'm not. No, it's not. It's in the Gulf of Laconia, right? But anyway, it's famous for the mechanism of Antikythera, which is a mysterious machine from the ancient world, right? Which was discovered in like an archaeological artifact. We don't know exactly what it did, but yeah, Antikythera says he actually mentioned this interesting thing, right? So as we all know, the way how I describe, how I explain, like on my competing explanation to the evidence of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, the way how I would describe accounts of Jesus supposedly appearing to groups of people and not just individuals, right? Is this for the appearances of the Gospels? I just think these are plausible narratives which were crafted by Gospel authors based on their existing worldview and their sources. So the Gospels, in my opinion, were not written by eyewitnesses. They didn't have any connection with eyewitnesses, but they were actually written by people decades later, basically, who were already Christians. They were already convinced, obviously, that Jesus was raised. They knew their Old Testament very well, and they had some previous Christian tradition. They might, for example, have some creeds that talk about Jesus appearing to groups of people. And when they wrote the Gospels, they did what every ancient author at the time did. They basically created a plausible scene, a plausible setting, a plausible dialogues, and characters present based on a combination of what they already believed to be true and what was found in the resources, right? So I don't think if we could time travel to the first century and interview early Christians, I don't think we would be able to actually find a person who would truthfully say, yes, I think I experienced seeing Jesus putting fingers into Jesus's holes, right? There was never anyone like that. This is a fictitious story. It's written maybe about people who actually existed in history, but I don't think they were actually people who had experiences of this happening. That's how I explain it. But when it comes, for example, for appearances to groups of people in 1 Corinthians 15 in the Creed that we were talking about 2 streams earlier, the way how I explain them is by granting that these actually really talk about experience that people had. But then I just point out that there are completely natural phenomena that have external existence. So multiple people can see them at the same time, right? So it's not a hallucination hypothesis, right? So the objection that hallucinations or dreams are private to the mind of individuals and they are not shared amongst a group of people, that objection doesn't apply because I'm explaining it by pointing to things that exist outside people's mind that can generate these kinds of experiences. And one very frequent phenomena of this nature is pareidolia, which is just defined as a human tendency to see meaningful pattern in various phenomena, natural phenomena. They have a very wide range of religious applications. We see them in religions, including Christianity, Islam, Hinduism today, and also in the ancient world, right? There are really good examples of accounts, historical accounts, which looks like they are actually describing pareidolia. And I just pick one of these many, many possible explanations, and I posit completely ex hypothesis, right? This is theoretical, unobservable. We don't have any evidence for this, but this is just how I explain it. And I think it's a much more probable explanation than an actual resurrection, an actual appearance of Jesus, is that a group of people, group of early Christians was actually walking outside, and then they saw a Jesus-shaped cloud. And they already believed that Jesus was raised from the dead. So this wasn't a cause of their belief. It was just a confirmation of their belief. And I think this is specifically tied to the idea of the suffering servant from Isaiah being highly exalted in heaven and the figure of the Son of Man being seated next to God's celestial throne. So what they probably interpreted the pareidolia as was a vision of Jesus being seated in heaven on a celestial throne, which for them cemented their existing belief that Jesus was actually was actually raised, ascended to heaven, and then he was highly exalted and is now sitting at the right hand side of God in heaven next to his celestial throne. Right. This is in much more explicit terms, for example, what Stephen sees in the book of Acts. Right. He actually sees heaven open, and he sees Jesus. But Antikythera actually says that this explanation works much better. It provides illumination. It allows us to make better sense of a specific feature of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. Because after Paul lists various people that Jesus appeared to, he says, then last of all, as one untimely born, Jesus also appeared to me. And then he says that because he is last of the apostles and he used to persecute Christians, right? And what Antikythera is pointing out is that this explanation actually makes better sense of him referring to himself as a one untimely born. The Greek word is actually just abortion. Paul is calling himself abortion. The term is used, for example, in medical literature, and it just refers to aborted fetus. I think I saw one instance where it could refer to a fetus which was carried like a much longer than it would be normally the case, right? So it wasn't a premature birth or abortion. It was actually the fetus being aborted after a much longer pregnancy. And he's essentially saying, look, I always found it very weird that Paul would call himself one untimely born because he wasn't untimely born. He was contemporary with the Jesus' disciples, right? So this couldn't be talking about him missing out Jesus on earth because it wasn't due to him being untimely born. He just didn't see him, right? There is nothing about the date when he was born that has anything to do with it, right? But it would make much more sense when this is talking about him missing out on this initial experience of pareidolia, right? Because it would essentially say, I was born too late to experience this. And then if you actually look up that comment thread, I don't actually know which video that's under. So you now have to open every video on the channel. You have to look it up because we are actually continuing the conversation, and I think it's quite interesting. Okay, let's go on. Derede Dasein, Gerede Dasein, which I think is an expression in Greek, and it's really now really ashamed because I don't know what that means. But I should probably look it up, right? Because ein is the infinitive present active suffix in Greek verbs, right? Thematic verbs. He says Yahweh understood as king in his celestial court. So this is what when I was talking about God in the Old Testament being depicted in very human terms, and specifically, it looks like it's the Old Testament authors were imagining essentially a royal court, a court that would be the case for rulers of empires of their own time. For example, the Assyrian Empire or the Egyptian Empire, right? Where you would have the monarch, who is the sole ruler of the realm, surrounded by a court of people who perform various functions. He would, for example, have angels, which literally means emissaries, right? He would have accusers, Satan, right? Satan, obviously, in the Old Testament is not the devil. The kind of dualism between good and evil being kind of headed by Satan as a divine being doesn't exist yet. Shows up a little bit in the book of Daniel, but it's actually one of the many theological innovation of the intertestamental period. But yeah, in the Old Testament, Satan is just the accuser. He is actually one of God's buddies. He is a part of God's celestial throne. And to this, the comment points out a really interesting passage from Aristotle Politics. The reason all people say that the gods too are ruled by a king is that they themselves were ruled by kings in the distant past, and some still are. Human beings model the shapes of the gods on their own and do the same to their way of life as well. That's an amazing quote. And the same guy goes on to say that we were talking about how even in antiquity, non-Christian authors rejected the depiction of Greek and Roman gods in mythology because they thought they are not appropriate. Especially the behavior that the gods manifest in these myths is not appropriate. They like kidnapped women and raped them, for example. And there was a wide range of response to these myths. Some people try to harmonize them and basically allegorize them, right? So say, okay, it's not the case that there is actually a guy named Zeus and he kidnapped a guy named Ganymedes. It's an allegorical story that tells us something, and then they make up their own allegorical meaning of the passage. We all probably seen people who do the same thing, maybe with different religions today, right? And then the opposite extreme would be people who completely rejected the mythology, right? Or at least to a large degree. And he says Plato rejected Homer and Hesiod outright for attributing more to flaws to the gods. And shout out to Xenophanes, who specifically took Homer and Hesiod to task for the same impiety. And there is a fragment preserved by Sextus Empiricus. Homer and Hesiod have described to the gods all the deeds which among men are a reproach and a disgrace, thieving, adultery, and deceiving one another. And this is, again, amazing. I want to include also this highlight this very famous fragment by Xenophanes, where he says, "But if cattle and horses and lions had hands, or could paint with their hands, and create works such as they do, horses like horses and cattle like cattle, also would depict the gods' shapes and make their bodies of such a sort as the form they themselves have." So here's Xenophanes, who again rejected anthropomorphization of the gods in traditional Greek religious tradition, is basically saying, look, if animals could create statues and paintings of the gods, they would depict them as being animals, right? And we, of course, know that Egyptians, for example, did that. And do you know what was the Greek explanation for that? Greeks had admired Egyptian culture. Egyptians were amazingly influential on Greek thought, architecture. If you look at the Capitol in the US, if you look at the White House, what you're seeing are obviously Greek temples, essentially, right? The neoclassical architectural canon is derived from the classical style, but that itself is derived from Egyptian architecture. And most of the techniques which were characteristic for the Greeks were originally developed by the Egyptians. So we still owe like massive debts to Egyptians in all kinds of areas of human life, least of which is architecture. And the Greeks explained why is it the case that animals are worshipped as gods in Egypt. They just invented a story of the Greek gods or the gods which actually existed, like Zeus and Hera and Athena, hiding in Egypt for a period of time in form of animals to escape their adversaries, either the Titans or the giants, which were the two major enemies of the Olympian gods in Greek theology, right? So yeah, this is really interesting. The same guy, we are talking about Bellerophon, which is the maybe there is a fragment from this Greek play by Euripides, which could be the earliest account of an atheist written by an atheist about atheism, right? We don't know for sure whether Euripides was an atheist, but it's a really good candidate. He says, not to be a fool and believe some ancient stories. Look at it yourself. Don't make up your mind just because of my words. bears comparison to Heraclitus's epistemology, listen not to me but to Logos. That's absolutely correct. And I would add to it this comparison. So on the left, we have the fragment from Euripides. I think it bears repeating because it's really amazing. Is there anyone who thinks there are gods in heaven? They are not. They are not. For any man who wishes not to be a fool and trusts some ancient story, look at it yourselves. Don't make up your mind based on a story. That's maybe, plausibly, the earliest text, the surviving text of an atheist about atheism. Sounds like pretty good advice, right? I just wanted to juxtapose this with some of the passages from the Bible. And if you go to Nathan Ormond's channel, I recently did a stream with him. We were talking about why is it the case that Christians so often fall for conspiracy theories. And this is what we were also talking about, the kind of anti-intellectualism, and specifically the mistrust of authorities, including intellectual authorities, right? Because in Christian dualism, in the Christian apocalyptic worldview, we all know that this world, so everything under the dome, under the firmament of heavens, so the air and the earth is ruled by Satan and his archons, his rulers, the rulers of this age, right? Archons of this eon. And they are evil. And the earthly authorities, so the heads of states, the governments, for example, the ones that crucified Jesus, right? They are under their power and they are like essentially doing their bidding, whether they realize it or not. And that, of course, includes scientists, experts, maybe in economy, sociology, right? Like if you already reject, for example, evolutionary biology, and then people start claiming that there is actually climate change and it's going to have massively devastating impacts, and we are burning large piles of money every day by delaying action, the money that we will have to pay in the future to deal with it, well then what's one more science for you to give up? You already thrown out biology, so why not climate science, right? All of it comes from the same evil source, right? And Paul in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians says, yet among the mature who do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age or the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. So what's the wisdom of the age? It's just the wisdom of Satan and his minions. And later on he says, for the wisdom of this world is folly with God. So again, we have this divine wisdom and the human wisdom, not so good, right? And in 2 Corinthians, he says, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to obey Christ. Compare that with Euripides. I think this is massively telling. And of course, in Proverbs, we have trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, which is directly the opposite of what Euripides, or at least Bellerophon says, right? Look at it yourself. Do not rely on a story, right? Don't be fooled by a story. So yeah, this is really interesting. And a couple of last comments. Sutra Stevens actually gave me a really interesting idea for a stream where we would look at some non-Christian accounts from antiquity, and we would apply the same flawed methodology that Christian apologists apply when they talk about resurrection, right? So if we actually followed their methodology, what else would we have to believe? And I think this is a really interesting thought experiment because, for example, we all know that, and this is what Christian apologists are going to tell you, that the ancient world was very masculine and it was extremely humiliating for someone to be crucified as a criminal. So nobody would actually follow a guy who was a criminal. Nobody would conclude that he's actually a divine being. or that he is a god, right? It was actually massively emasculating to be crucified. Well, I guess that's why nobody thought Socrates was impressive, right? That's why Socrates was just completely forgotten, and he didn't have any followers because he was executed, right? Um, yeah. We have, of course, Attis, the followers he was a god who castrated himself, and his followers castrated themselves. That's pretty emasculating, if you ask me. And what's more interesting is that for like many years, decades, castration was illegal in Rome, and followers of the Attis were still doing it. So there must be definitely something to it, right? And just recently, reading about late ancient literature, I came with this amazing meme, which is the cult Mithraism. The cult of Mithras was religion which was extremely popular in late antiquity in Rome, in the Roman Empire, and it was particularly popular in the Roman army. But it was actually the religion of the enemy, right? The biggest opponent, the strongest competitor in the international arena of the late Roman Empire was the Neo-Persian, the Sassanid Empire. And what came out of that empire was Mithraism. The cult of Mithra was actually one of the state-endorsed religious systems. But Christians, obviously, Christians, late Romans were actually at conflict with the Persian Empire, right? There were two actually Roman emperors who were killed by the Sassanids, and one of them was captured, and he was held in captivity, and he was humiliated by the Persians. But somehow, amazingly, not only did the religion of the enemy spread to the Roman Empire, it was specifically popular in the Roman army. And maybe you might be tempted for thinking that this is like not relevant. Maybe Romans didn't see it that way. Maybe they thought this is not problematic. But actually, that was totally the case with a different Persian religion, right? So Manichaeism, which was of course founded by Mani, who claimed to be reincarnated Jesus, probably, or at the very least he claimed to be a prophet. That religion also was very popular in the Persian Empire, but it was specifically persecuted by the Romans precisely because it was the religion of their enemy, right? So on one hand, we have Manichaeism, which came from the Persian Empire, and Romans dislike it. But then we have Mithraism, which also came from the Persian Empire, but the Romans actually endorsed it. It became very popular, and it was specifically popular in the Roman army. So clearly, there must be something going on with Mithraism, right? Because why else would Roman soldiers of all people adopt the religion of their mortal enemy, especially given that they rejected a different religion of the same mortal enemy, right? I, of course, think that there is like a perfectly naturalistic explanation for that. It has to do with Mithraism having like a very strong militaristic component to it. The theology places massive value on strength, physical strength, and the cults of Mithras had a very strict, almost military discipline to them. So I can definitely see why Roman soldiers would find them appealing. Then Locutus the Borg says about Cicero. Cicero invented and used in oration the figure of speech called praeteritio, which is Latin for I shall omit. Oh yeah, obviously. When talking about an opponent, he would say something to the effect, I shall omit my opponent's thievery and won't mention his cruelty. Still used today. Yes, that's definitely true. I didn't look up any examples. But it's like, as I mentioned a couple of streams ago, Cicero is the person that we know the best from the ancient world. And at least to me, he's completely insufferable. He's really smug, arrogant. He's full of himself, and his forensic speeches, so speeches given like during trials, are really really amusing because he's super ironic and he's super sarcastic all the time, right? He actually makes fun of his opponent. He's, for example, praising him very often, but the praise is actually like a false praise, which is meant to show some flaw in his character. And yeah, this is something that he actually says all the time. Like one of the very important strategies in ancient law and ancient judicial practices was practices of practicing law was actually to depict the person accused of a crime as someone who either plausibly could have depicted the crime, that was obviously the job of the accuser, or alternatively to depict him as the kind of person who would never commit such a crime. That was obviously be the job of the defendant, right, of the defense. And this was done, for example, by talking about various flaws that the person had. Maybe it could even be his ancestry, right? Like one of the worst thing that you could say at a court about someone who is charged with a crime is this: his mother was a prostitute and his father was a teacher. Obviously, the second is much worse than the first because teachers were usually slaves. And even if you were not a slave, if you were a teacher, you had like one of the lowest positions in ancient society. So yeah, this was like one of the ways how to besmirch the person that you are trying to get executed, for example, or get in trouble legally. Or you could, for example, and if you're trying to defend him, you could bring up his bravery in wars, right? Like in this and that battle, he was in the first line, and when everyone else ran away, he was the only one who stand there defending his homeland, right, his country. That's again something, and that would be sad even if the case is actually about something completely different. Like maybe it's about him not paying his debt in time. But yeah, that was just the strategy. And Cicero basically gamed the system by mentioning flaws of character, by saying, I'm not going to mention them. And obviously, by not mentioning them, you are mentioning them, right? So he was just a complete dick, and I love it. Okay, and last comment, if I'm not mistaken, from David22585. And this is not going to embarrass me because it's not going to include any Latin words that I should know, and it's not going to include any Greek expressions that I can't even tell if they are Greek or not. He says there's an argument for the sphericity of God in there somewhere. This has to do with something that I said in the stream, one of the streams, where I talked about how different, I don't place very much value in philosophical arguments and theological arguments that eventually boil down to our intuitions. Like, if you waterboard Josh Rasmussen for 2 hours, or maybe just for 2 minutes, you will eventually get to his entire career boiling down to his personal intuitions about what is and isn't the case about perfection, the God, goodness, and stuff like that. Fair enough. It's a completely legit career because he's not necessarily arguing that his personal intuitions are like metaphysically correct, right? He's essentially saying if you also don't find these things intuitively plausible or probable, then these other things follow from them through some arguments, right? Either deductive or probabilistic. Fair enough, right? But I just don't place that much value in it because these intuitions seem to be over the place, and they actually seem to be culturally dependent. We are conditioned into having them. We are not born with them, and we don't come to them through investigation of what's actually the case in the world. We are shaped by what people around us already think about these kinds of things, right? And I just mentioned that the sphere was considered to be the most perfect shape, right? And David made a joke saying there's an argument for the sphericity of the God. You can, for example, say that God is the perfect being, and being a sphere is more perfect than not being a sphere. So God must obviously have to be a sphere. I think that's meant to be a joke. But lo and behold, they were actually people who thought that the God is a sphere. And I supposed to have a quotation from Diogenes Laertius, but I think I accidentally deleted it. So pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. But yeah, the Diogenes Laertius wrote biographies of famous philosophers, and he wrote a biography of Xenophanes that we already talked about. That's the guy who rejected anthropomorphism of the gods. And Diogenes Laertius specifically says that Xenophanes believed that God is a sphere. So this is not a joke. There were ancient philosophers who believed that God is spherical. To be fair, we are not exactly sure if Xenophanes really believed that, because when it comes to a lot of these pre-Socratic philosophers, we don't have obviously any of their writing. We only know what other people said about them. And as we've seen in today's stream, in case of some of the Christian authors, that might not be exactly accurate, right? Maybe their positions got misunderstood. Maybe they got misconstrued. We don't even know if the people who wrote about them had access to their original writings. Maybe this is like second or third hand account. So in some cases, it could be just completely false. Like imagine if in 2000 years, the only thing that we knew about Marxism, we knew from speeches of Donald Trump, right? We probably wouldn't have a very good idea of like what Karl Marx actually thought. We might have some like vague outlines, but it's not the same as having Das Kapital, right? So that could be the same situation. But if we take it at face value, it seems to be that there were actually philosophers who thought that God is a sphere. So these were the two things that I wanted to do. I thought the stream is going to be a little bit shorter, but no, apparently. That will be 2 hours as well. So first of all, I wanted to show you links to some interesting YouTube channels that are now defunct, but I think they are still worth checking out. And you will find the links in the description of this stream. And the second thing, we're just highlighting some comments. So again, feel free to comment. Your comments don't have to be nearly as insightful and interesting, but hey, if you have something cool to say it. Because this is actually how I became involved in this. It originally started with me fact-checking Pine Creek in the comment section under his videos, right? I just found his channel, and he said a lot of things about ancient history which were false. For example, he thought that Antiochia is in Greece. So I just commented and maybe added a couple of interesting things. Then we started talking on Facebook. Then I get invited to his stream, and here I am with over 300 subscribers, right? So definitely comment. You don't know where your life will take you. And now for something completely different. So let's switch gears and let's talk about bachelorette in the ancient world. So there is this famous show, The Bachelorette, and really the idea, the concept is as long as time, right? As old as time, right? It's the idea that there is a father who has a beautiful daughter and he wants to marry her well. So he invites suitors. This is a little bit similar to the story in Odyssey, but in the Odyssey, the suitors kind of invite themselves, right? And Laertes, who is the Odysseus' father, actually doesn't want to have anything to do with them. But actually, this idea was already there, obviously, in antiquity, and we have this really hilarious description of Bachelorette TV show in ancient Greece. It's of course narrated in Herodotus because Herodotus has all the most hilarious stories, and he says Cleisthenes, not to be confused with Cleisthenes, the famous Athenian politician. This is Cleisthenes of Sicyon, who was a tyrant. He made a proclamation that whichever Greek thought himself worthy to be his son-in-law should come on the 16th day from then or earlier to Sicyon, and Cleisthenes would make good his promise of marriage in a year from that 16th day. Then all the Greeks who were proud of themselves and their country came as suitors, and to that end Cleisthenes had them compete in running and wrestling contests, right? So, who were the suitors actually? Who were the people who came? Well, we have, for example, a guy who was the wealthiest man alive at the time. He was one of the suitors. So that's definitely a guy that you want to have as your potential son-in-law, right? Then there was a guy who was the strongest Greek alive at the time. So obviously in culture that valued physical prowess, that might not be that bad. Then there was a son of the tyrant of Argos at the time. And this tyrant, his name was Phaedon, was the most arrogant Greek alive. He, for example, at during one Olympian Games, drove out the refugees, the referees, not the refugees, the referees, the Olympian referees, the people who were actually overseeing the competitions, and he just held the Olympic Games by himself, like for himself, basically. There was a guy who apparently once hosted the Dioscuri, the divine twins, Castor and Polydeuces. And then there was a guy who supposedly surpassed all the Athenians in wealth and looks. So he was not only very rich, supposedly the wealthiest person in Athens, but he was also the most handsome. So amazing suitors, right? So Herodotus says, when they arrived on the appointed day, Cleisthenes first inquired the country and lineage of each. Then he kept them with him for a year. So the whole process, the bachelorette show, was for a year. There wasn't, as far as I know, any process of gradual elimination. There was just this one initial assessment, testing their manliness and temper and upbringing and the manner of life. This he did by concerting with them alone and in company, putting the younger of them to contest of strength, but especially watching their demeanor at the common meal. So how they behave, at the table. Do they have manners? As long as they kept them with him. And he did everything for them and entertained them with magnificence. So you might be all asking yourselves, what happened? Who was the suitor that actually got picked, right? Well, there's something interesting happened. After a year, Cleisthenes announced that he is going to finally decide who will be the winner. And he will actually organize the wedding, the actual marriage. And during the marriage feast, he will say which one of the suitors is going to be the one to marry his daughter. He sacrificed 100 oxen, of course, performed hecatombe. So there was this massive feast. And this is what happened. As they sat late drinking, Hippocleides, which was the wealthiest and the most handsome Athenian, so Hippocleides, not far from outdoing the rest, so he was actually doing very good in the competition, ordered the flute player to play him a dance tune. The flute player obeyed, and he began to dance. Pretty standard stuff, right? Like, I think we all know the feeling. You're sitting at the table with your friends, hanging out, maybe in a pub. So you hit the jukebox and start dancing. I suppose he pleased himself with his dancing, but Cleisthenes saw the whole business with much disfavor. Why? Why didn't he like this? Hippocrates then stopped for a while and ordered a table to be brought in. And now you might be thinking, if there's a feast, why don't they have tables? Well, they didn't have tables because, of course, Greeks didn't sit; they laid down when they were eating. When the table arrived, he danced Laconian figures on it first, then the Attic. Last of all, he rested his head on the table and made gestures with his legs on the air. So we have to imagine standing upside down on his head, dancing like this. And if you know about Greek fashion and how people clothe themselves, you immediately see the problem, right? Because he was probably wearing a tunic. He was wearing chiton, right? And what happens with a chiton if you are standing upside down? Well, the same thing that happens with a skirt. So then Herodotus says, now Cleisthenes, at the first and the second bout of dancing, could no more bear to think of Hippocrates as his son-in-law, because of his dancing and of his shamelessness. But he had held himself in check, not wanting to explode at Hippocrates. But when he saw him making gestures with his legs, he could no longer keep silence and said, Son of Dysandrus, you have danced away your marriage. And Hippocrates said in answer, it does not matter to Hippocrates. Since then, this is proverbial. And really, this is one of the most popular idioms. This is one of the most popular, not necessarily a proverb, but like a reference or a saying in ancient literature. It's quoted many, many times. It doesn't matter to Hippocrates, right? And it was basically an expression of you being cool with something, you not minding, right? There is this meme of like these guy with white hats, right? Like drawn characters with white hats. One of them is having this kind of smirk, like cool smirk, very composed, collected. Maybe he's actually wearing a mask, underneath the mask he's crying, but the expression on his face is exactly the kind of thing that this saying is meant to convey. So that's it. Thank you for the stream, for your participation and your attention. Let me just look at some of the comments. So yeah, basically they saw his dick and everything else. And now let's maybe head over to Discord for an after party. I will, guys, give you the link because I need to grab it. And the link should be in the description down below, but I'll just copy it here in the chat. And let's go there. I will probably won't be there for long because I have stuff to do tomorrow morning. Actually, the whole day is going to be super busy because I'm wrapping up a project at work and it's extremely, extremely difficult and the customer is very demanding. So yeah, let's just wait for a while for people to jump in and I will join you shortly. When you go to Discord, go to voice chat alpha because it's for the alpha males and just wait there for me. I don't want to end the stream immediately because then the link would be lost, but you should actually see the link still. If you refresh the screen and the chat is gone, you will still see the link in the description because it's in the description of all of my streams. You should definitely join the Discord. It's the Academic Biblical Criticism Discord server, ABCDS. I don't run it, so I take no responsibility for what's happening there. But I hear the people running it are cool. And there is a lot of participants, a lot of interesting conversations going on. And there is a lot of there is a lot of content, like a lot of resources that people actually collected, right? So if anyone joins, we're going to have a nice conversation. If you don't join, you can't, something like that, don't worry. I don't care. So see you next week.